Today, we are so blessed to have a special guest, Aryeh Green, who is from Israel. He's been living in Israel for 40 years and he grew up in the United States of America. You're welcome. Highly welcome, Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, today he's going to share with us on key topics in somewhere else they are very critical, but to us they are very essential. So I'm gonna ask him to tell us a few things about his perception on peace in the Middle East, and also before we go there, obviously, I will then bring him from the Middle East to Africa. But before we do all that, Mr. Green, would you mind telling us what you are doing right now?
My vocation is bringing renewable energy fields to Africa, based here in Jerusalem for a company called Gigawatt Global, and also as one of the co-founders of a United States nonprofit called Gigawatt Impact with similar goals. And I've written a new book called Finding Peace in the Promised Land, From Hatred to Humanity, which is making some small contribution to policymakers and spiritual and religious leaders and others, educators, what have you, to looking for pragmatic steps to take towards peace here in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis, between Muslims and Jews and Christians, and all the people of the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. How does it feel right now for you personally to be living in Israel at a time like this?
It's a wonderful miracle to be living in Israel at a time like this. When you say a time like this, I'm not sure if you're referring to the conflict with Iran and its threats to Western civilization, Israel, America, Europe, Africa, and everybody else, or whether you're referring to political upheaval in Europe, America, Israel, and elsewhere. But I have to reiterate, it's a miracle to be living in Israel. It's not just the Holy Land, it's also a beautiful land inhabited by beautiful people, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and many others. And it's a wonderful place to raise a family and a wonderful place to live. And I know that might be a surprising answer, but I always say, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper or hear or see on the media. Mark Twain once said, if you don't read the newspaper, back in the day there was no social media or television or radio, but he said, he's apparently is quoted as saying, if you don't read the newspapers, you are uninformed. If you do read the newspapers, you are misinformed. So your question presupposes difficulties and challenges, which I'm not minimizing. Yes, there are difficulties and challenges for all of us in every country and region that we might be living in. There's poverty, there's war, there's social upheaval, but all that having been said, here in Israel, yes, we have lived for 100 years facing the hostile and violent opposition to our very existence. And we continue with that battle, but at the same time, we thrive with great resilience. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place to live. And it is indeed a miracle.
You have written a book, Peace in the Promised Land, and because you're here, we're going to get this opportunity and hear from you a summary of that book on what you feel and think about peace in the Middle East. Especially, would you say that Israel is at peace right now, starting from maybe 3 years back through today?
No, of course not. No, Israel's not at peace. And it's a very frustrating reality to live in. But the truth is, I think much of the world doesn't recognize that most of us in the Western world, while we think we live at peace, perhaps with our neighbors or with others in the world, there really is no peace for Western civilization as long as radical jihadist Islamist organizations work to destroy our way of life and to kill, murder, and maim civilians across the Middle East, Africa, Europe, America, and elsewhere. So no, unfortunately, we do not live in a time of peace. But that presupposes a different question. Is peace the highest value of our civilization? Or is our existence and our thriving and our protecting our way of life the highest value? Peace is something that's worthy to pursue as a goal, and that's the title of my book, because it's important that we have that as our main objective and hopefully a shared objective with others in the region. But as long as there is no peace, as long as we are threatened, our way of life is threatened, our children, grandchildren, parents are threatened, whether in Nigeria or whether in Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East or Africa or Europe or America or elsewhere. We have to stand up and defend ourselves. And that's one of the fundamental messages of my book, that if we're looking for peace, we have to engender a movement from hatred to humanity, from the jihadist, terrorist mentality and approach to value system in the world, and their rejection of everything that is Western, Christian, Jewish, what they call infidels, and destruction of not just Israel and America, but most of the rest of the world, and move them and move that from an attitude of hatred to an attitude of benefiting humanity.
Do you think that it is possible to end the radical jihadist movement?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. Absolutely possible.
Would you like to share some insights with us?
Well, when I wrote my book, which provides 5 pragmatic and transformative steps to bring a real resolution to the conflict here in the Middle East, between, as I said, Arabs and Israelis, but also between Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others. One of the main thrusts of the book is reliance on traditional Muslim and Arab sources, normative, traditional, both medieval and for the last few hundred years, and recent and current statements, leaders, and beliefs, which show that normative Islam has as its goal the same values, the same conceptual frameworks that Christians and Jews and others have been pursuing for generations. Our challenge in the last century or more is that the rise of Islamism, meaning the political usurpation of Islamic religious thought, Islamism with its Islamist and jihadist ideology, has become ascendant, especially here in the Middle East. That doesn't mean that there are no moderate or pragmatic or centrist or reasonable voices in the Arab or Muslim world. Our challenge, and that's one of the points of my book, is to amplify those voices of the real moderates, of those who are really looking for reconciliation, who are looking for peace and to live in coexistence with Jews and Christians and others, to amplify their voices and to demonstrate that this isn't a Western concept. It's not a Christian or Jewish concept, the idea of moderation, the idea of tolerance, the idea of acceptance, the idea of forgiveness or a sense of purpose or a goal that would benefit humanity, that these are all ideas which are shared with normative Islam and with the development of Arab culture over the last few hundred years. And it's our responsibility, all of us, including those of us who are not Muslim and not Arab, to help encourage those trends that are focused on reconciliation, on moderation, on tolerance, on acceptance, and coexistence, to become ascendant in Arab and Muslim society, and to challenge the mullahs of Iran and the leaders of Qatar and Turkey, and as supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Islamic State and the others in that axis of terror, which we're all obviously very familiar with, especially since October 7th, but it goes back 100 years to the massacres in Hebron in 1936 and before.
Okay, from what you've shared with us, I seem to have understood you've classified the Muslim community into basic groups. One of them being the general one, and then the one that has been there for a long time. But then the second one being the one that is violent, if I put in my own words. So let's look at the ones who are violent. What do you think is the leading factor? What makes them want to spread fear and terrorism around the world?
Well, that's a question that I can't really address because I'm not a social psychologist and I'm not a political scientist, and I'm really not a student of the leadership of these radical Islamist, jihadist ideologies. But I can say this, that every dictatorship, every totalitarian or authoritarian society in history has shared the same goal, and that goal is control. And that goal is power. And with the power and the ability to control, it's an ideology which looks to expansion and empire, like Erdogan in Turkey was talking about just the other day, which is an explicit part of the ideology of the Islamic State and Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, is the spread of Islam, which is an evangelical trend within Islamic thought. Normative Islam, traditional Islam, did not believe necessarily in spreading Islam by the sword. That was something that obviously Christianity had for 1,000 years. Forcible conversions, inquisitions, and what have you. It's something that Islam has developed over the last few hundred years. But it's an interesting side note to history that scholars and historians point to the fact that a lot of the spread of what we call Islam, of what we call the Islamic Empire, was actually the spread of Arab political military empire building, and it was based much more on that kind of socio-political, cultural, call it the tradition of humanity of expanding empires for the aggrandizement of more power, of more wealth, more control. It was not necessarily a religious imperative, and wasn't really adopted as a religious imperative until perhaps 100, maybe 200 years ago. And it's a very, very interesting element of an understanding. Traditional Islam was very tolerant of Jews and Christians, not in the sense that sometimes is bantered around that there was a golden era where Muslims were in control in Spain and throughout parts of Europe and Middle East and North Africa, and everybody lived in peace and harmony. No, Jews and Christians were second-class citizens. But my point is that at that point, Islam as a religion and the leaders of Islam did not follow this path that they are today, which is destroy all the infidels, destroy Western civilization, and force conversions by the sword, like the Islamic State movement and others today are doing. So that radical Islamist ideology is definitely what I'm separating from both normative, what I call normative Islam over the last 1,300 years, and the majority of Muslims around the world. And that we know that the huge populations of Muslims in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India, and of course also throughout Africa and in many countries in the Middle East, like Morocco, or the United Arab Emirates now, and others, are much more moderate than these radical jihadist leaders of Hamas and ISIS, Hezbollah, and obviously Iran, and their supporters in Qatar and Turkey, as I said.
So, for those who are listening to us, we are on the Ministry of Reconciliation podcast. Obviously, as you can hear from our special guest today, Mr. Green, for those who are listening and you coming from the Muslim community, just know that we are not speaking against you. Obviously, even when you hear from him, he's a man of peace. Yeah, and we don't want to lose everyone. Everyone has been created by the living God, and he loves everyone.
Indeed,
Yes.
indeed, indeed. And I always make the distinction, Emmanuel, between the leaders of these jihadist ideologies and their responsibility for educating their people in this culture of hatred, and making a distinction between them as leaders and the vast majority of Muslims and the vast majority of Arabs who, like most human beings, want to get on with their life, want to live in peace with their neighbors, are interested in pursuing, if not real coexistence and reconciliation, certainly pursuing both the spiritual fulfillment, economic goals, national goals, and reasonable personal goals that we all wish to support our families and to build a better life and a better community. So yes, you're quite right to make that distinction. I always do make that distinction.
Thank you very much. And we are going, if you don't mind, I'm going to take you back to Israel. We are going to shift away from the every community surrounding Israel, and then we go to Israel before I bring you to Africa, because you also have programs to support Africa.
Yes.
So, yes, everything else around Israel put aside, what do you think can bring peace to Israel?
Well, one of the main themes of my book, which I've implied already in our conversation, is that peace will only come with this kind of transformation in the wider Arab and Muslim society. And when Arab and Muslim leaders, like those of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco, the Abraham Accords partners, when other leaders join with the same ideology, accepting Israel's existence, accepting and acknowledging the connection of the people of Israel to the land of Israel as the indigenous people of the land. And this isn't a demand for a reformation in Muslim or Arab society as much as it is a simple objective recognition of the fact that without such a transformation, there will never be peace. And so the positive statement in answer to your question is, and I'm very confident peace will come, and peace will come when those moderate leaders in the Arab and Muslim society are in the ascendancy, are in positions of authority and are educating their societies for this kind of acceptance of not just Israel, but Jews, Christians, others who they call infidels, and Western civilization on an equal footing, and focusing rather than on the goals of destruction of America, of Israel, or what have you, focusing on goals of building better societies and providing benefits to their own people and to humanity. And that's why I like pointing to the Abraham Accords. It's one of the things that helped me to write this book. On the negative side, the October 7th horrific, brutal massacre and kidnapping of civilians on October 7th, 2023, was one impetus for me to finish writing this book, because it enabled me to speak much more frankly about these issues as we have been. Because up until then, everybody was, including myself, always very concerned to be balanced. Well, we can't attack the Islam. We can't attack another religion or the entire Arab society, and we still can't. We still don't want to attack an entire religion or entire society, but we can now, after October 7th, very clearly articulate our rejection of the barbaric, hideous ideologies of hatred and murder and rape and brutality that we saw on October 7th, without having to beat around the bush and try to balance that with some criticism of the West or America or Israel or others. But on a positive side, the other impetus for my coming out with the book now was that the Abraham Accords are basically an expression of the kind of humility and acceptance and forgiveness and focus on shared goals and shared values and shared sense of purpose that I talk about in the book. And it's those kind of leaders, and I quote a lot of leaders from Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates in the book, as I do a lot of traditional Muslim and Arab thinkers and scholars and religious leaders going back 1,000 years, and contemporary leaders, to bolster this main contention that peace is possible, but it will only come when the kind of reconciliation that you talk about so frequently on this podcast becomes the leading ideology in Arab and Muslim society, to replace the ideology of hatred and death and destruction, which unfortunately the jihadist and terrorist leadership in some of those societies have forced upon their people, which is basically a twisted understanding of what normative Islam or traditional Arab society has pursued over the century.
Do you think the peace of Israel is dependent on the decisions of nations around Israel?
It's a wonderful question. First of all, I rely on God and God's hand in the universe and on current events. And I know from my faith that God has a plan. We may not always see it or understand it. In fact, we almost never see it or understand it. But the plan is there, and He has spoken very clearly about the importance to Him of Israel's, the people of Israel, living in the land of Israel. And so I don't think that our existence is dependent on the actions or the behavior of others. But you're asking specifically about peace. And the common understanding of that word means an absence of war. And an absence of war in our situation over the last 100 years has depended entirely on those who oppose our very existence, or the establishment of our state, or the legitimacy of the return of the Jewish people, the people of Israel, to the land of Israel. And as long as that violent and hostile rejection exists in societies which have enough power to wage war, then we won't see a lack of hostilities. We will always have to defend ourselves, and we won't have the kind of peace that you and I believe that we're talking about, that we envision. I envision a peace like the peace between France and Germany, which I talk about a little bit in the book also. France and Germany were at war for 800 years. And if you had this conversation with one of the leaders of France or Germany 100 years ago, they wouldn't have even understood the conceptual framework that put the idea that peace was the highest value they could pursue. They had national interest to pursue, an economic interest to pursue, and their national identity and pride to stand up for. It was only after the horrendous destruction of World War II, and obviously the ideology, the barbaric ideology of the Nazis, that brought Germany to a transition internally and brought France and Germany to the point that they could create the European Union and see their future together with shared goals, even though they still have, and have today, different interests and different policies to pursue, and various different arguments about all sorts of strategic or tactical issues. But they have an overriding shared value which focuses on reconciliation and cooperation and coexistence. And that is a very, very important perspective to take. 800 years they were at war until finally both societies recognized that peace is better than war. We're in the same situation. We have pursued peace for 100 years. The Jewish people have pursued, the people of Israel have pursued peace for 3,000 years. And we have been forced to defend ourselves, and our defensive military operations, which are a form of war, of course, have been forced upon us. And we are praying, singing, believing in, hoping for, and working towards peace and making concessions for peace constantly. We have for the last 1,000 years, 100 years, 50 years, 20 years, 10 years, and in the last 3 years since this current stage of the war with these forces of terror has been as intensive as it has been.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question is that real peace, as I say, will come with a change of ideology and a change of leadership in the Arab and Muslim societies around us. And until that change comes, we will not have peace. But I have to add, you asked in the beginning what it was like, to live here in Israel. You walk down the street in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Bat Yam, in the Galilee, in the Negev, and there is peace in the sense of a peaceful society that works together even with our disagreements to better our society. And there's peace between Arabs and Muslims and Christians and Jews and all other minorities in the country of Israel. And there's peace with many of our neighbors, with Jordan, with Egypt. It's a cold peace, admittedly, not as warm as with the Abraham Accords with Bahrain and Sudan, United Arab Emirates, and Morocco. But we're getting there, and peaceful relations with other Arab nations, I believe, are very much in the near future going to emerge.
Thank you so much. At this point, of course, we cannot really answer all the questions, and that is the reason at this point you have to help us know where can we find these books that you have written.
Thanks for asking, Andrew. So my first book, My Israel Trail, which is about my trek on the Israel National Trail and recovering from divorce, and with some very helpful guidelines for other people facing similar personal challenges, whether it's divorce or death or being fired or what have you. And my second book, Finding Peace in the Promised Land, From Hatred to Humanity, are both available on Amazon and all the main other book-selling platforms. And I welcome people to reach out to me with responses and questions or arguments as well. I can be reached at aryeh.green@gmail.com, and that's ARYEH as it's written on the screen, .green@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, and so you can find me if you're looking for me just by using my name.
Thank you very much. Bringing you to Africa, you are you traveling around to Africa?
Well, I've been to Africa a number of times. We built the first utility scale solar field in sub-Saharan Africa in Rwanda over 10 years ago. We also built the first utility scale solar field in Burundi just a few years ago. Our company, Gigawatt Global, and our nonprofit, Gigawatt Impact, are active in over a dozen countries across the region, including in South Sudan and Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Zambia, and others, and the DRC and Burundi, I should say specifically. And I myself, I've been to Rwanda, and I've been actually to South Africa. I haven't visited our other fields yet because most of my responsibility in the executive management of the company is raising investment funds and raising donations, charitable grants for our nonprofit. So I spend most of my traveling time focused in London and New York and other financial capitals rather than coming to Africa. But I very much enjoyed my visits to Africa, and I expect to be there again soon.
Yes, using your Middle East experience, what would be your advice for peace in the Great Lakes region of Africa?
Well, it's actually an interesting question. And Emmanuel, I'm not an expert in the various conflicts in the region. I'm very aware of them because of the business that we do in the Great Lakes region. But I would say that the themes of my book, I could have written a book about finding peace and ending conflict anywhere because these themes are pretty much universal. We haven't reviewed them. I can go through them very quickly if you'd like because they're very basic. There are 5 elements
Yeah,
in
it's
the
all right.
book. Okay.
Mhm.
And these are the 5 elements from my first book, which helped me to deal with my personal challenges. And they're simply applying those 5 elements to international conflict. And those elements are humility, a sense of appreciation for our our place in the universe, that God controls the world and we don't. We can't necessarily either solve everything, or moving to the second point, the second element is acceptance. And the acceptance of the reality that we're facing is part of it. Based on that humility, we can accept that we cannot control everything. We can accept the reality of the challenges we're facing, including the reality of the grievances of others who are in conflict with us, and acknowledging that and accepting their identity, their reality, is a very important step towards resolving conflict. The third step I call gratitude, which is simply an appreciation for our blessings. Like we started our discussion today with a prayer and thanking God for the ability to have this kind of a conversation, both in Muslim and with Christian, as well as in Jewish and other faith traditions. Gratitude plays a very important role of centering us and enabling us to work towards resolving conflict. And that leads us to the fourth element, which is forgiveness, which is an integral part of all of our religious traditions, as well as a significant foundation for any real reconciliation, for any real conflict solving, because you have to be able to forgive he or she who were your enemy for harms or injuries caused, or even perceived injuries caused. You have to be able to forgive the other in order to be able to develop a relationship with the other party, which is based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than hatred and rejection. And that forgiveness plays a very, very central role in the book. And I think it's going to play a very central role. It already does play a central role in the peace that we've already forged between Israel and different Arab countries. Anwar Sadat spoke very eloquently about that, as did Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin and others in Israel over the years, and Menachem Begin in particular. And then the fifth element, which is the most important, is this issue of a sense of purpose. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, used the Holocaust as the basis for the development of a whole school of psychology, which noted that people who have a reason to live are more likely to survive facing challenges, whether those challenges are as onerous and horrific as the Holocaust, or whether those challenges are more, let's say, more localized situations of conflict, which are also very challenging and difficult, or whether they're personal challenges. If you have a reason to live, Viktor Frankl wrote and developed this theory, which basically proved that if you have a reason to live, you are more likely to survive and to thrive. And so the idea of having a sense of purpose, having a goal or a set of goals to pursue, applies equally to nations. And that's where we can talk about reconciliation between countries. If your goal is to destroy Western civilization in America and Israel, so we really don't have much to talk about. But if your goal is to provide benefits for your own people, to benefit humanity, to help develop both society, economic development, social development, human development, if that's your goal, based on your national cultural traditions and your religious traditions, then we have a common language and we can seek to pursue those common goals. And that's why one very important section of my book are very pragmatic and practical steps that can be taken by policymakers, by educators, by religious leaders, by cultural leaders, by individuals and families and communities, pragmatic steps to reach the kind of goals that I described in the book. Those are the 5 elements that I believe you can apply not only to the Arab-Israel conflict, or the Muslim and Western civilizational conflict, but to conflict in your regions and elsewhere, between peoples, between communities, between societies.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I hope you will come back. And thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you for having me on.